Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. We hear over and over again that the future belongs to China. Looking at what the Chinese are accomplishing in both infrastructure and technology, it's easy to see why. But what about in human relations and issues of gender? As the Me Too movement reshapes, or at the very least recalibrates, the nature of sex and work and gender relationships in America, it's worthwhile to look and see how and if these same issues are playing out in China. What we find is not entirely surprising, that an entire cadre of well-educated and financially successful women are taking their place in China. The result is that the deep, deep traditions of Chinese society are having to change in ways that are even more difficult than perhaps all the physical changes that China has endured. We're going to talk about this today with my guest, Roseann Lake. She's the Economist Cuba correspondent. She was previously based in Beijing, where she worked for 5 years as a television reporter and journalist. Her coverage of China has appeared in Foreign Policy, Time, The Atlantic, and Salon, and she's the author of a new book entitled Leftover in China, The Women Shaping the World's Next Superpower. Roseann Lake, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff, for having me.
It's great to have you here. How much of the rise of women in China is a reflection of a global trend, and how much of it is indigenous to the particular circumstances in China?
That's a great question. So much of what's happening to women in China is completely on track with what we've seen in developing and developed countries. As women gain more access to education, their timelines for young adulthood change. Marriage and motherhood get pushed back, or maybe don't happen at all. We've seen this trend in most Western countries with the rise of more and more women getting married later or not at all. And China's completely on par with that. It's also, we've seen a similar trend in other East Asian type of economies. So Japan, South Korea, Singapore, it's been more common in all of these places because, women get access to other things. Marriage is one of many things that they consider and sees it to be sort of the cornerstone of their lives or the sole priority. Where things get a little bit different in China are China's characteristics. So one, the fact that there was a one-child policy in China starting in 1979. Although this could have never been predicted, what seems to have happened is, given China's traditional preference for sons, many baby girls were aborted or killed after birth. And this happened primarily in rural areas of the country where parents, being a bit more traditionally minded, wanted to have a boy, and when they also wanted a boy to be able to help them out working on the farm. Whereas in urban areas, it seems parents were a bit more open-minded. They, if they got a girl, it was kind of like, all right, well, maybe we'll keep a girl. If you look at the demographic breakdown of the gender imbalance, you'll see it's a lot more acute in rural areas than in urban areas, where it seems parents were a bit more open-minded. Okay, we've got a girl, we'll keep a girl. She doesn't have a brother. We don't have a son. We're going to raise her as if she were our son because she's our sole heir, and our family's honor depends on her. So we're going to push her to study and to achieve and to be the best possible person that she can be, which effectively, when multiplied by the many households in which China saw its first generations of only daughters, you get this very well-educated class of women who have had unprecedented opportunities and to, of course, given the natural trend of, when this happens to women, no longer see marriage and motherhood as the sole things that define them in their young adult years and have other things that they'd like to do at the same time. So you've got that, and when you consider just this one other Chinese characteristic, you've got the one-child policy on the one hand that leads to this gender imbalance, this first generation of only daughters who get this access and are able to become what they've become, but you also couple that with the effects of tremendous economic growth, which happened primarily during their lifetime. And of course, these women or, people in urban areas benefited much more from this growth than people in rural areas. And so that has really just accelerated the extent to which they're very different from their moms and their grandmothers because their lives are different and the opportunities that they have are completely different from those of, their moms who perhaps grew up during the Cultural Revolution and didn't have that access to education and didn't have the ability to spend time figuring out who they were and who they wanted as a life partner. In those times, the work unit was very prominent. And if you showed up for work without a partner, there usually wasn't housing for unmarried couples. So you were just partnered off with somebody else, and life carried on. So there are many more options now, as women all over the world in developed and developing countries are having increasingly. So I would say at the time, China is a very poor country and it's a very wealthy country. And in many ways, as I argue in the book, it's kind of the pitch-perfect diorama for looking at where women stand in the world, because on the one hand, what's happening there mirrors a similar shift we've seen in other countries. But then if you look at the lives of, women who are not as well off in China, their lives may resemble more the lives of women in India or parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So you can really kind of see, the different situations of women around the world based on just the women who are in China, which, is actually home to the world's largest population of women, for now at least. So it was a fascinating place to study and to report on.
How much of it was shaped by Western influence?
Well, there's a huge population of Chinese students studying in the U.S. There are 330,000 students Chinese students studying in the U.S., and many of them are women. And so, of course, once you leave China and you're exposed to a different culture, you have greater access to different media, right, to movies, to television shows, and to just classmates, of course, that's going to play into your idea of sort of how you want to be when you're in your 20s and the sort of life that you're looking for. But I wouldn't blame it exclusively on Western exposure. I mean, that certainly played a part. When I was living in China, The Big Bang Theory was by far one of the most popular television shows in China, which is, of course, a U.S. television show. And young Chinese students, they understand American cultural references. But I think more than anything, this shift is due to just a rise of the individual in what used to be a fiercely collectivist society. For the first time, I mean, a lot of these kids, they are only children, and they've been given a whole lot of resources. And so they're a bit more individualistic in how they choose to go about things. They maybe, instead of taking strong recommendations for what they should study in college, maybe there's a bit of pushback, and they choose to study, a career or, prepare for a career that they're more interested in. So I think it's a combination of factors, right? The idea of being abroad, having that exposure and that sort of autonomy, being far from, the influence of parents who are trying to sort of prod you into the sort of life that they'd like you to have, maybe, a career as an engineer or natural sciences or something, and then married shortly after. So they're far away from those traditional networks, but also, just seeing things differently because they're exposed to other cultures outside of China.
Talk a little bit about how the men in China of that generation have understood this or pushed back against it.
For the men, it's tricky because, as I talked about earlier, you've got these men in rural areas who are quite poor. They've not experienced the same economic growth as China has, that, people in urban areas have. And as a result, for them, it's actually very tricky to find a wife because they are in surplus, right? There are 20 million more men. There will be 20 million more men of marriage age than women in China by 2020, which means that something like 1 in every 5 Chinese men will be numerically impossible for him to find a wife. And this is especially true for men in these areas because they don't have resources to bring to a marriage. So if these men are in short supply, parents are thinking, well, we're not going to let our daughter get married unless it's a match that we consider as favorable. And so because men kind of have to compete amongst one another to attract a wife because there's just not enough women to go around, monetary resources become very important. And this has stoked, an industry of bride buying from other countries to attempt to, bring back the numbers to attempt to meet the supply that is just not there. So there's bride buying from places like Thailand and Vietnam. It's also stoked, very unfortunately, an industry for bride napping because there is a market in China of men who find it very hard to get married and need to sort of outsource their wives. Then, of course, there are men who are born in urban areas who are in a very different situation. On paper, they may be equivalent of many of the women that I describe in the book. So, born into relative affluence or, families that are relatively middle class or well off, some education, exposure abroad, maybe bilingual. And for these men, they really, essentially they have their pick of the lot, right? They can, pretty much any woman in China would be keen to marry a man with those characteristics, at least on paper. Now, it does seem that there are men in China who are a little bit lost in how quickly the role of women has changed, right? So if they're looking at what their mothers were to their families as kind of a model of what their future wives might be for their homes, for their lives, it gets a little tricky because it's so different, right? What was expected of women when their moms were growing up is very different from what women who are currently on the marriage look for. There was actually a Spanish demographer who I cite in my book who said, and this wasn't specific to China, but I think it rings particularly true in China. He said, men are looking for women who no longer exist, and women are looking for men who have yet to exist. And I thought that kind of perfectly nailed this idea that, men maybe want a more domesticated or a more traditional model of woman. And it seems like there are fewer and fewer of those types of women in China. And women are perhaps looking for, a bit more egalitarian husband who's willing to share things more, the burden of taking care of children and housework and everything else, do that a bit more equally. And there aren't quite too many of those yet. And this is purely anecdotal, but I can give you an example of one of the characters or one of the men that I interviewed as part of the book. He was a catch on paper, well-educated, good job in finance, bilingual, all of those things. And I said, what do you look for in a wife or in a woman? And he said, well, I think that women should be like plain yogurt so that men can flavor them as they'd like. I was kind of, rather in shock by his idea, but very grateful that he shared it with me because it was enlightening. It helped me understand that, this is the position that someone were coming from. And he just explained to me, a woman that has too many ideas before breakfast, she just makes my life more complicated. I earn a good salary. I know where I want to live. I know where I want to work. And it's just easy to be able to decide those things on my own and not have to take into account the viewpoint of someone else. And so when we had lunch that day and we were doing that interview, he was actually on his way back to his hometown for his bachelor party because he had just gotten engaged. And he really had me wondering if he was engaged to a woman or a dairy cow based on his requirements for how women should be.
To what extent has this been an issue that the government has taken notice of? And if so, to what extent has it shaped any public policy in China?
Well, there's now a two-child policy in China. It took effect 2 years ago. And certainly it's a response to all of this. I mean, the Chinese government has noticed that its numbers for population growth are just not what they should be. The population is shrinking, it's getting older, and that has a whole lot of economic repercussions because it means that you have fewer and fewer young people, young workers paying taxes to support an increasingly older population that, has a pretty long lifespan. And so to remedy this, and also because they're aware that, much of what China has achieved has been due to its power in numbers and the fact that, those numbers may be shrinking has economic concerns, this two-child policy was instituted. I don't think it was, let's give our women greater reproductive freedoms. I think it was very much, we need more babies. We need to tell women that, that they need to have more babies for it. And based on numbers that have come out, it seems that the number of babies that were expected to the modified policy the number of babies born are actually nowhere near the number that the government had hoped would be born. So essentially it's emerged that, fewer than expected women have had children. And actually I've heard from some people, midwives and people who work at hospitals, and these are, higher end hospitals, so the numbers may not be representative of what's going on in China as a whole, but I have heard that more older women than expected have had children, which has led actually to a higher number of birth complications. And I don't think any of this was really planned for when the two-child policy came to be. It was kind of maybe rather naively assumed that, okay, there's a two-child policy, everyone's going to rush to have two children. But that hasn't happened, and it's been for various reasons. I mean, on the one hand, the whole premise of what I argue, you have a rising population of leftover women who are, beyond the age of 27 and they're not married. And if they're not if they're not getting married, if they're getting married later or not at all, obviously that's going to have an impact on how many children they have, notably because it is very difficult to have a child outside of wedlock in China. There are very high fees for anyone who does, and a child's residence permit or hukou comes through its father. So it's very hard for that child to access education and all sorts of basic things if his parents are not married. It's also very complicated for women in China to seek out fertility treatments, namely egg freezing. So one would think, if China's government is trying to increase birth rates, a two-child policy is perhaps a good step. I would say eradicating the policy altogether would maybe be a better one. But doing things to make it easier for women to have, children on a longer time scale would also make sense. But as of now, unless a woman is married and has an illness that is expected to impede her fertility, she's not able to freeze her eggs, which has actually stoked a huge industry for Chinese women coming to the U.S. to have their eggs frozen. This is something that is, becoming more and more common. And actually, someone described it to me as we'll get a manicure and we get our eggs frozen. It's just one of those things that you do with your girlfriend as part of, of a plan for the future. And so it's certainly a concern that the government has. And I think there's probably no clear answer. I mean, you can't suddenly oblige every woman in China to have 2 children. I do think it's looking pretty likely that by March, the next time the Communist Party gets together, the 2-child policy will probably be abolished altogether. I mean, this is what some demographers and people who are closer to this science have said. So it's a serious concern, and there are certainly many policy adjustments that can be made to increase birth numbers, but they haven't really been rolled out as yet.
What's transpired in terms of women, some of these women that we're talking about, rising to leadership positions in sciences and corporations, even in politics? What we're seeing is there are more and more Chinese women, and I was just in San Francisco this weekend, and it's incredible and really heartening to hear about, how many women are in the venture capital space, and how Chinese women who sort of work in both places, in Silicon Valley and in China, talk about how their impression is it seems easier for, women-run businesses and just women in general to be involved in this venture capital space. So they're investing in, artificial intelligence and robotics and things that we probably don't have as high of a percentage of women in the U.S. invested in or involved in, or just getting capital to start pushing products of that nature. So you really do see that. I think Chinese women really excel in the sciences in that regard, because there's just this idea. I mean, they're involved in the space, right? They're not afraid to make money, and they're involved. They have prominent roles as far as that goes. That hasn't necessarily translated to politics. And part of that may be that it is very hard to rise in the ranks of the Communist Party. We see that was made harder over the weekend. Xi Jinping is now going to be in power until 2023. So any hopes of having a woman in office before then are very severely dashed. And actually, there were some jokes going on social media. One that I really loved. There was a young person saying, they were talking about the marriage pressure that they were fielding from their parents, and they said, my parents said that I needed to marry before Xi Jinping's term is up, and now I've got, a whole lot more time to remain single because he's going to stick around. So, I don't see that really translating to the political space, but of course, the private sector is tightly linked to what happens. And I think as women, it's not easy. It's certainly not easy. There's some very seriously entrenched, discrimination and things that we see everywhere else. Talking about China's situation not being unique to China. These are universal problems for women in the workforce. But I think as women make more and more of a footprint in the private sector, that may help tip the scales eventually. And the private sector has been more accepting overall?
Yes, I would definitely say so. I mean, it also helps that, some of the women are born into families that own businesses. And because they're only daughters, who else did they pass this business on, or this inheritance, or the family wealth, right? And because these women are also they're educated abroad, many of them, right? They've been primed and poised. They are poised to take over family businesses and to excel, in the private sector on their own. You're definitely seeing more and more of that. I mean, Chinese women are ambitious. They're getting higher education. Their numbers of women getting GMAT and taking GMAT and getting MBAs are right up there with the boys. So they really are, that footprint is expanding, and it's going to be a very important part of China's story going forward.
And is this similar in terms of what's happening to other Asian countries as well? Are other Asian nations around China dealing with similar kinds of problems in terms of their traditions and their issues?
They are and they aren't. So this is something that I also, towards the end of the book, I start making comparisons with Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, other East Asian tiger economies where, the economy took off very quickly and the status of women changed, or the expectations of women changed in a very short time. A country that hasn't managed this transition very well is Japan. It's no secret, Christine Lagarde has brought it up often, that, Japan's economy is not what it should be because it has failed to incorporate women in the formal economy as it should. It's not uncommon for a woman in Japan to have a child and then check out of the workforce for 13 years to take care of it, because there's some stigma associated with, outsourcing childcare, even if it's to parents. And so Japan's economy has suffered. I mean, when you have half of your workforce taking care of one child, it's not necessarily the most productive way to have women, reaching their full economic and professional potential, and then by extension just contributing to household spending, right? To what a household income, and by extension consumption tax, right? So Japan hasn't fared so well. South Korea is slightly better. But the researchers that I consulted for the book make it very clear that they're still not a model. There's still not really an example of too many women in Korea who have managed to have rewarding careers while still tending to all of the things at home, and just being fulfilling that role of mother that's expected of them. So I would say, and of course Japan and Korea are places where women are very well educated. So I would say that in this regard, China has a tremendous advantage, because since the Cultural Revolution, which certainly had its flaws, women have been involved in the formal economy in ways that they've not been in other places. And they're certainly involved now. They're very productive members of it. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, they were the factory girls, right? There's an excellent book by Leslie Chang that talks about the huge economic importance of this population of women when it came to China's story of being the manufacturing capital of the world. That story has now changed, right? A lot of, the narrative for young women is not so much centered on smokestacks, because a lot of manufacturing in China is migrated to other places. It's too expensive. Wages are too expensive. And so it's been passed along to places like Vietnam or Thailand, are, finishing their manufacturing. China is switching to a more knowledge and service-based economy. And for that, when you think about the sort of talent pool that it has to be able to meet the demand for these new positions in the knowledge economy, women are a huge part, because they've been educated and they're qualified to accept these roles. So I don't see them as being excluded from them or not being involved, suddenly not being involved in the formal economy as they've been in other East Asian tiger economies. And that's why I'm more optimistic for China's economic growth in the future.
Roseann Lake, her book is Leftover in China, The Women Shaping the World's Next Superpower. Roseann, I thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today.
Thank you for having me, Jeff. I appreciate it.
Thank you.